In today's episode, we get to meet Steve Pruett, who is the executive chairman of Cox Media Group, which is a media organization with radio and TV stations across various markets, providing news and entertainment to the American people. Steve's story is incredible. He has had a remarkable career, starting from humble beginnings on the farm, working side by side with his 4'10", 100-pound force of a grandmother that ran the homestead, until now as an executive chairman at a major media organization and planning for his next growth cycle. We talk about his book, The Gain Principle, which is about growth cycles in your personal and professional career and what he's learned in his growth and how he can impart that into the next generation. I loved this conversation with Steve. We went down so many rabbit holes, but stick with it because it is inspiring. He talks about what he learned along the way, what he wishes he had learned a little bit sooner, the experience of losing his two sons and what that did for his own growth and learnings and how he's dealt with the grief in that. It was just such a powerful conversation, and I'm so grateful to Steve for having it with me. So take a listen. This is a good one. So Steve, what is your why?
So I thought about that a lot over a lot of years. I get asked by different people, and the best I have been able to come up with from the earliest days of when I started doing anything was I just wanted to make things happen, right? So, my story is, as I started out, really on the farm and, blue collar parents. And my why was really just to make something happen. And that when I really thought about it, that was in every situation after that. And sometimes the making things happen sometimes was volatile. Sometimes it was, a short-lived job or career. But I looked at that pattern over my entire career and it was the same. And wherever I went, whatever I did, my lean in, and in my younger days, it was pretty aggressive. And then now, as I'm getting, toward a different kind of a career rather than running a business, that why is to give people visibility as to the how, right? So it started out with like, I want to make things happen. And then over this last, 5 or 6 years, I've thought, well, I've talked to a lot of people about their situations as both mid and late career. And I also talk to a lot of young people that work for us. But they want to know, how do I advance? How do I do things? And what I try to do is lift, the veil, right, on this is what your bosses are probably thinking. This is what their bosses are thinking. This is what your board is thinking. This is why this is happening. And, that because early on, my cultural bend was kind of extreme inclusiveness. I just told everybody everything. And so in my early jobs, I just didn't have any like filter kind of. And then that created this idea. Now I've named it inclusiveness because of what I know today. That's not what was called then. It could have been called a lot of things. But basically, I just included people. And when I started building companies, that was the same way I went about it. If I needed to raise money, I told everybody, we need to raise money. We need to break even. We need to pay our debt. We need, it was just, that was the way I built the companies. And, we're going down this path. And so I just didn't really know any different. The first 20 years or so after my founding career, I went into corporate life, and there I got a real education on corporate behavior.
On the dangers of radical transparency in corporate America?
Yeah, it's not that welcome.
Yeah. No kidding. I've heard you describe your wife as being very savvy and holding her cards close to her chest, and that you have been typically very open. Did you learn from her how to kind of
Well,
close up a little bit?
yeah, to some degree. It was funny that in my high school yearbook, my English teacher wrote, "You're incredibly brilliant and talented, but you leave yourself wide open," right? And uh, to this day, I remember that, right? And I didn't know what that meant. But yeah, I'm pretty open and accessible, and I've been lucky that my behavior has been such that it hasn't really uh, bitten me in a bad way. I've had some ups and downs, I've had some bumps and bruises, I've been taken advantage of, but all in all, if I had it to do over again, I would maybe be a little more guarded than at times. But yes, my wife, who was in business with me early on in our career when we were building television stations, she is she comes from an Italian American family, and they were more guarded. They were just more guarded about everything. Not that they're closed off, but that they know that some things you should keep to yourself and maybe play your cards.
Well, I play with this idea a lot because I think that there is a lack of authenticity that emerges from the corporate politics of being guarded, right? That for some people they can be very comfortable with, and for other people they can't be. There are unspoken seals of silence that cannot be broken without ever being explicitly mandated. They are the shared beliefs of an organization's culture, that you can't talk about this and you can only talk about that. The most obvious example is with layoffs, for example. When we're going to have a layoff, if you are in the inner circle that knows the layoff is coming and you're planning where the layoffs are going to be and how big the layoffs are going to be, I mean, that is so tight-lipped until which point we're welcome to tell the whole world, and then suddenly you're shocking the employees with that, and it creates this betrayal feeling in employees and an inauthenticity in the relationship that they thought existed before. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are on pushing the boundaries. I mean, you said you've been stabbed in the front, you've been stabbed in the back, and you've learned to walk the line. But generally, when you look at the CEOs in the world today, do you think they're being too guarded? Do you think that there's
Oh,
room for a
that's
little
a
bit
tough
more?
question. Guarded. So there's HR guarded, right, where you have to be cautious to uh, do things by whatever HR rules that are in place and whatever. You can't just randomly kind of announce things, right? You have to. Then there's the psychology of the organization, but I've been through this a couple times. In 2008, during the big downturn, I was the CEO of a company, and we had a layoff at that time, oh, well over 10% of our workforce. And everybody kind of knew that was coming, right? Because it was
Yeah,
such a tremendous
it was
downturn.
2008.
Yeah, right. And then when I so the reason for the feeling of secrecy, and when I got into the C-suite in the early 2000s, and of a company that I didn't start, right? I came in as a CFO to fix a debt-laden company. It didn't have a problem of having too many employees. It just simply had a problem of having too much debt. And it wasn't until 2008, by the time I had become CEO, that we had this massive downturn and we had expanded. So we had to cut back on our expansion. Later, as part of the whole restructuring and the way I became, well, that was actually earlier. Earlier, we had gone through a bankruptcy, and that's how I became CEO. As the CFO, I refinanced it, took it through a bankruptcy, and then became the CEO. The bankruptcy itself, we actually expanded. This sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And because bankruptcy is a form of financing for a company. And what we needed was rid of some old stuff, debt, and things that were dragging us down, and to do new stuff. And we were able to do that through the bankruptcy courts. But in talk about secrecy, but then it's all public. First, it's very, very secret. Then you go into bankruptcy, and then everything is public. And then we went into 2008, which was the downturn. And so that really was the 10 years I spent with that company, from CFO to CEO, and taking it through a couple of tough situations, really gave me insight to what it, how much to disclose, how to measure it, what needed to be kept in a small circle. But generally speaking, I try to push that out. Generally speaking, I don't like the picture of a handful of executives sitting in a room deciding the fate of the people when if they don't know what's going on. And I had an interesting question in a town hall here at CMG, where what was actually before it was after a town hall, between town halls, right? So we have a town hall, and then people surface questions to you later and say, hey, you said this. And someone surfaced to me, you and Dan, he's the CEO. He said, you guys always tell us how great we are and what we're doing, but we're having budget cuts. People, are wondering about their jobs. People are wondering about their futures. So I just got on the next town hall and said, let me tell you what this is about. I said, the people here have delivered. They delivered in the pandemic. They delivered in the ransomware attack. You have delivered against aggressive revenue budgets, but the industry has headwinds. And our job as senior management is to create a sustainably profitable company that can repay its debt and provide a return on investors. Hence, the I to expenses. It doesn't mean we're in financial trouble. It means we have a new reality being served to us by the industry we're in. And we're not alone. Traditional media in particular, and all kinds of other companies go through. I think if you spend any time on LinkedIn and read, some of the newsletter, Substack and Medium, and you read what people are writing about employment today and finding employment and their jobs, the culture that they're experiencing is this compression culture, right? Of, oh, I I don't, and sometimes that translates for a person into, I don't see opportunity for growth.
Mm.
And what some of the things that I want to write about and have written about are, there's opportunity in compression. You just have to understand how your ownership, your board, your executive level is thinking about it. And a young person came to me and in a totally different industry and said, our company's really growing. We're opening up. It was happened to be in the retail and fashion retail world. And she goes, I'm the manager of this store. And I know they're going to open more stores in California, and I want to be over all those stores. And I said, well, have you asked them what they're thinking? And she goes, no, I've just made a plan to tell them that. And I said, well, start with asking them how they're thinking about this expansion and how they're thinking about management of that, because they're probably already thinking about it. So, they're thinking like, well, we have to hire a manager over multiple stores. They may not think to look at an existing store manager for a variety of reasons. One is she's a good store manager. Why should we ruin that and make her a regional manager? And then the other one is that they just may be narrowly thinking like, we need a multi-store experienced person, right? So I guarantee you they're thinking something. They're not opening stores and not thinking about how they're going to manage them. So that happens to be a growth story. In a compression story, what the executives are thinking is, how do we save money? How do we get more productivity, more efficiency? And one of the techniques that I advise people to do, whether you're an executive or a manager or an operator, is find something other people don't want to do and just do it. And then find it, it works.
Yeah, going back to your why of to make things happen. I mean, that is
Yeah.
so just that persistence is so clear in you. That's why I laughed when you said it. Because I've read your book. You may not know, I was able to get a
Oh,
copy of your book.
wow.
And the story that you share about your leadership style, it's actually kind of how I feel. I haven't graduated to phase 2, which you talked about helping people see the how. I'm still in the well,
Oh,
get
you're
it
still in the
done.
high, you're like,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah, I
I'm
see
just trying
what
to
you're
get stuff
doing.
done.
Yeah.
Nonstop persistence in getting things done, and you just see what happens, right? But wait, can I go back? Because I want to hear the end of the story when you talked about the town hall
Yeah.
and you said, well, here's
Oh,
what's going on. We're focused on this. How did people react
they
to
loved it.
that
They
honesty? Of course
they
they
loved
loved
it.
it.
Yeah, they said, "Well, now it makes, now we understand. We thought you were just making us feel good by saying we rely on them to execute the plan, and they've done their part, right? The industry has dealt us some headwinds that have nothing to do with them, and it's just the industry we're in." And I said,
Yeah.
"We're going to ask you for as much as you can give us in terms of, I feel very strongly, and this is something that I probably say to the point of people wish I would shut up around work, right? Is we have to bring the people in on where we want to go and what we have to do. We have to get the input from the field. We have to ask, like, if we're thinking about a sales strategy that's an alternative, let's get some sales managers in the room and some general managers, because our business is out in the other markets. I mean, we have an Atlanta property, but mostly it's in other places. So we can kind of use the Atlanta property, but it's not really indicative. Atlanta's a bit of its own thing, and it's different than some of our other operations. So I said we need some views from people who have to execute this plan before we make the plan.
Yeah.
And executives kind of think like, well, I have to have the answers. And I think, no, you have to have the questions.
And I can't share a possible path that we might take because it might confuse or create fear, and so then people hold all their cards close to their chest, which I think is this inauthenticity that I
And then
don't necessarily understand.
it doesn't feel good, right? To the
Right.
people who are getting the message, right? If you bring them in and say, look, we need your advice, we need your thoughts on this. Yeah, you might get oh my God, we're going to X, right? That's the fear, is you tell the truth to people who aren't in the C-suite, or in the case of CMG, it's called the executive leadership team or the
Mm-hmm.
senior leadership team, and they're going to have a bad reaction, like to what you're asking. I would
Right.
say 9.5 times out of 10, they're going to go, really? Okay, here's what I would do.
Yeah. It's like assuming that employees don't have the intelligence, the wherewithal, the emotional intelligence to handle the truth in business. There's a quote from your book I want to pull for this, actually, because I wanted to ask you about this and we're on it. You said, from reading books about entrepreneurship and finance, I realized that businesses were driven by profit. So I set out to shift my thinking from employee to businessman. Tell us about that shift and the difference between employee thinking and businessman thinking and how to bridge that gap.
Well, uh, so that was a monumental shift for me. And I
Yeah.
made it in my 20s, fortunately. And that is the shift that is hardest to make, that allows you to have an extraordinary career, right? Um, and
Did you make that in the sales job working for Hal? Was that when?
no, yeah, boy, you really did. You not only read it, you remember
I read it and I
it.
remember it, but I want to ask you about a story I've heard you tell about that sales, but I wanted to know if it's
So,
connected to the shift.
there's like Hal, and then there's Manny Brooks, and then there's I was on. By the time I made that shift from business, Hal really put the nickel in my head,
Right.
that because that's how he thought, and he stayed my friend till he died, which was 35 more years after he hired me in my first real sales job. And he gave me a lot of the inspiration, and then came back into my life later as he had progressed and become an executive at Warner Brothers. He brought me one of my biggest, most successful deals. I had kind of taken a break, and he came to my house and was sitting in my kitchen. He said, I know you can raise money, for TV stations, and, we need to build a group of TV stations for it was then called the Warner Brothers Network, the WB.
Mm.
And what he really said was, he goes, I know you can raise money for crappy stations, and we have a bunch of crappy stations that need financing, right? And I said, well, I can't do this one at a time. Why don't we put a group together and go finance that? And that leveraged my whole life into another realm. That one deal in the 90s really changed the way people looked at me. So going back to transitioning from from employee
Employee to
to
business person.
business
Yeah.
person, I think first of all, sales really helped me do that, because when I was selling to TV time, I was selling to businesses, and I saw these. I never forget walking out of one of my clients with a $500 check and thinking, back in those days, I hate to tell you, it was that was the same as $5,000 today or more. So I thought, he just handed me, this money to go advertise his business. He's betting. He was a little appliance store, and I don't know. I remember standing outside just looking at it, going, "That's a lot of responsibility, right?" And he's counting on that. And so, going back to radical inclusion, when I would get a client, I would run around. This is how I learned how to build a TV station. I would run around to everybody I had to do to get Mr. Freezy's um, commercial on the air: production, traffic, continuity, art department. Back then, you needed a lot of people to do things. Now you can do it in your iPhone, and which I'm trying to get people to do, actually, and with AI.
Speaking of businessman mindset.
Yeah, and AI, by the way, AI
Yeah.
can
Oh, I
just
know.
make really good videos, and it could help people get on the air faster.
Yeah.
And so that's how I learned how to teach, because I walked to every department. We didn't have email, so I got to know everybody, and that was part of the inclusion. Right? I realized I needed these people to just do something as simple as get my customers' product on the air, right? And I had learned that in my job before that in promotion, because to get my promos on the air, I had to use a lot of those same kind of people, and I had to, interact with them. And by virtue of where we were technologically, a lot of that was in person, right? Um, and I don't want to say, I think in today it's much harder in ways than it was then, even though it was physically more difficult. You had to walk around and you had to see people, and you had to interact, right? And today you can kind of hide behind technology, and you can do things really fast, but you don't make as solid of a connection and to tell your story. But I don't know if I answered the question about when this was that I made this transition. It was after Hal. It was really, I left St. Louis, went to Chicago, was working in a national rep firm, and I had started reading. I'd, I'd gotten a vision across the country of markets where there weren't many TV stations. There were a lot of markets out there that had only one or two or three. And I thought, wow, what if, I could put TV stations in these markets, where they would be more competitive, and I could build a business. And then I started a friend of mine it's funny, I don't mention Charlie in the book, but he was really the person um, that sort of gave me the idea of doing a business plan. And I think I might mention him, but we were we didn't have any money, and we wanted to start a business, and we didn't know anything, so we started a consulting company, and we started telling people that they could start radio stations and writing business plans for them. So that was really the point where I made that like idea of that these are businesses, and there's money that has to go in, and you have to return that money, and you have to make a profit. And that was it. I mean, that
So,
spun me
what is
up.
the one or two defining characteristics of the difference between an employee mindset and a business person mindset?
um, I think it's that I think a defining characteristic is I am going to go do something about this, as opposed to asking somebody else why I don't have this. Like
Mm,
a lot of times employees will say, well, I need these things to do my job, right? And partly and that's their right. I mean, you need to supply people what they need. But when you're shifting into the businessman mode, you say, well, I've got to go get this, right? I've got to
yeah, it's
solve this.
accountability. You're essentially talking about accountability is making the choice
Right.
to focus on what you can control to drive results as opposed to saying, "Hey, somebody, I don't have,
Yeah.
the ability. There's a roadblock. I'm stuck.
Yeah.
Someone fix
And
this."
go to your boss with the idea of like, hey, if we had this, we could make more money, and this is how we all could, I could raise the whole enterprise, right? Not just what I need, but I think we would be more efficient. We would be, I think the mindset is a difference. And then it's interesting. I never, in all of my business building and all of my career, I never thought about the money. I just thought the money would follow. And I got a real wake up call, believe it or not, much later in my life when I was in investment banking. And I had a partner, and I was spinning up these big deals, and we were getting, paid significant fees. And one day he was traveling, and he said, go in my office. He was nominally my boss, but he was really my partner. He said, go in my office. And he goes, I need you to look in my desk drawer, and there's something in there I need you to get for me, right? And tell me what I left it there. He needed a number or something, and he didn't want anybody else to see it. Well, when I went in his desk drawer, there was a sheet of paper there. And on that sheet of paper, he had written down everybody in the New York office, what their deals were, and what his share of the money would be. His share of my money, right? Now, I knew I mean, it was just a given that he was going to get a share. That's how the investment banking business works. You bring in fees, and there's some people that are at the table with you. You're, in the food chain, and you
Yeah.
get a certain expectation. But he was keeping track of my money and what his share would be. And I went, and that's the kind of stuff my wife says, they call her, it was funny, they used to call her the collector, right? Because
Yeah.
when bonus time would come, when I was an investment banker in New York, everybody knew her, right? Bill, my partner, everybody knew her. And she would take up these issues on my behalf, right? As being unfair or whatever. And we used to laugh because we were in the Seagram's building, and they have this big fountain out front. And in December, they empty the water, or November, and they put Christmas trees in there. And I said, oh, it's time for the annual money grab, which is the bonus time, right? Because the trees
Yeah.
are in the fountain. Well, that became adopted in that company as, in the New York office, anyways, like, okay, it's time for the money grab. The trees are in the fountain, right? Because everybody would be going through what they did for the year and get their money, right? And Paula would very much like be like, "Hey, you deserve this is what you deserve," and there were some funny instances around that, and they were all learning curves, right? But that was when I really started to think about like, oh, I need to like maybe think a little more. I was building, making things happen. I knew I had to get to profitability. I had lenders, I had investors, but I never thought about what am I going to take? What am I going to
Mm,
get? That was not. I can't say that I'm particularly good at it still, and and it's just never been a part of my thing. It's just like if I can build something. Now I have employment agreements and have had employment agreements, equity agreements, comp agreements. Mostly, I don't even read them. I mean,
really?
I even like I still, I'll often look back and say, I should have read that a little more carefully. I missed something there. I've not been unhappy. I've been treated, more or less fairly. But when you come to the end of a business cycle and you leave it and you have either shares or options or things, there's a negotiation. It's not always just like, well, this is what's in the document, right? There's an opportunity to negotiate on both sides, right?
Yeah.
And it's no different than when people negotiate their pay. But I think being, a salesperson and then being a person who got paid to sell money, right? Selling money I was the happiest I ever was when I had a small shop and I was doing deals for people and raising money for people. And um, that only ended because we went through a bit of a downturn in the early 90s and I just decided I wanted to do something else. I was tired. I mean, it's a lot of work, a lot of travel. And then I took a break. I went back in and I ramped up and I traveled from Phoenix, where we live, Carefree, where we live. I went to the West Coast 20 times a year. I went to our LA office and I went to our New York office 24 times a year. So I was gone, Sunday through Thursday. And sometimes I traveled in between to other places. And I think, but I don't, know that today is the way you would have to do it, with technology and with other things. And knowing what I know now, I might be more selective about that travel. I was like, got to make something happen.
Got
So
to make it happen.
I'm going to
Yeah.
go see this guy. I'm going to fly to Cleveland. And
So you've also, I heard a story of you getting feedback that here's the flip side of the gotta go make it happen personality. You talked about being given feedback once that was maybe
well,
challenging to
which one? The one
receive.
that I was hyperbolic and
The bombastic, the ego
bombastic
is
and
thine enemy
hyperbolic.
guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That was tough to take. And it really made me mad at the time. And um, the person that gave it to me is still, I would say, I think of him as a friend, but I had sponsored him to become the CEO at Sinclair.
Hmm.
And he had helped me on my deal, my original deal. He was an investment banker. And I brought him in and I introduced him, and he helped me finish, which was a bizarre thing in and of itself that a guy who already owned a large TV company would invest in my startup TV company. It just, it was the most unexpected thing that ever happened to me that David Smith, who I mentioned in the book, who was the founder and builder of Sinclair, said, "Yeah." I went to him and pitched him the idea. And then I think I say in the book, he asked me, "What do I need you for?" And I said, "Well, you need me because I know how to do this." I was, it was different than the company he had. But Chris Ripley was working with me as my investment banker. And he helped me tremendously. Later, he came in as CFO of the company. And then when it came time for Sinclair to have a new CEO, um, I didn't really feel that was what I wanted to do. And so I kind of volunteered. David, I said, look, I think Chris, he's young, he's got runway, he could do this. And he was the one who told me that, right? He was the one who said to me, and it felt a little traitorous at the time. But it honestly, and then he told me a book to read, Ego is the Enemy. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. You probably know.
Ryan Holiday.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
He's one of the stoic kind of guys that
Yeah.
uh, has a big following. And it like, oh, okay. So I'm by this like I am. So my coach, which I've had for, I'll tell you a funny story about that. I've had a coach since 2007. I've had the same executive coach since 2007. And, but anyway, the, uh, the ego that I put that right in there with passive aggressive. And I think of them not only as things that need to be controlled, but they can also be tools. And it drives my coach crazy when I say that, Pat, hey, it's a tool. She pretty much tried to take it out of my bag over the years, but I still, it's a light version, but sometimes you don't need to say exactly what you're thinking when you're in a conversation with in a negotiation or something like that. That's when it can be a tool, and you kind of say, well, I might go along with that. That's not a bad idea. And then you choose a path to come back around to the negotiating table, saying, I didn't like that after I thought about it, or you use it as an open door to go down a path that they presented, but you don't quite close that door, right? When they say to you, hey, what do you think about this? If it's unpalatable, you try to. Um, David Smith, of all people, who is one of the toughest people I ever met, told me he could never guess what that I had. My wife calls it like a baby face, like it makes no expression.
Yeah.
But I trained myself with David because I believed him to be almost, if psychic is a thing, that guy is psychic. If I had something in my head, either that or he's one of the best reader of people I've ever met. If I had something in my head when I went into his office, it would upset the energy. So I had to go blank, like, and then remember what I went to see him about, because he would read and react before I said anything.
That's interesting. The passive aggressive tool I've learned to use is mostly I use with my boyfriend when he says something and he's so righteous about it, whatever his opinion is. I just say, you may be right.
There it is.
He's
It's a
very
tool.
pleased with that response, and I'm pleased with it as well because
Yeah.
I know he's not, but I say he may be right.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
That's funny.
I agree with that. So we probably have gone down about 5 rabbit holes here,
Oh,
getting great.
totally. This is the most rabbit holey conversation ever, but it's also fascinating. So why did I ask you about the bombastic ego
Yeah.
feedback thing? It's because, I mean, I feel like most of our work when we're working with companies doing culture transformation is trying to get people to give each other feedback.
Hmm.
Because it's hard for Dave to do that, to say, you know what, this is how people perceive you. Here's a book you may want to read. You did eventually say, even though it felt traitorous at the time, that it was transformative for you and a great
And,
gift to
and
be
and
given
I
that.
have since had a couple of occasions to give that book to somebody else.
Right. And did they feel
They
like it
didn't
was
feel
traitorous at
great.
first?
They took it really hard,
Yeah.
and but it helped them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why we avoid giving constructive feedback because we don't want to hurt each other's feelings. It's actually coming from a good place, but it's the courage to lead. It's the courage to not value being liked over being helpful.
I'm going to double down on it. It was true
Yeah,
about me.
really.
It was
Well,
true.
I mean, we all have an ego, don't we? I mean, of course
Well,
it's
I
true.
had kind of like I was overusing that strength.
Yeah. Well, that's the make it happen. That's
Yeah,
the, I mean, a go, go, go person. I'm the same way and I have the same fault,
yeah. You don't
character
come across
defect.
as you don't come across as but that's your training, right? You
We've
don't come
only,
across as super egotistical or
well, we've
bombastic at
only been
all.
talking for 30 minutes, Steve. I mean, give it time. uh, so,
Well,
okay. We haven't even talked about the gain growth cycles, and I want to give that some space because I have questions about it. So, do you
sure.
want to? Um,
Well, and I was
it's a
trying to throw. I want to be mindful of what impact I can give you on culture building and how not just necessarily tell my story, but I think that the main thing I want message is, I had a story of building entrepreneurial companies that were often underfinanced and growing and uncertain, and then I had a time of corporate kind of culture building, and they're very different.
yeah.
And gain. So when a lot of people over the years would say to me, how did you do what you've done? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So what have I started off with, well, what have I done? Okay, if you just take the beginning and where I am today, it's not the end, but it's maybe the end of my quote corporate career as we wind this, as I we prepare this business for exit and whatever happens. Um, I'm not going to go do another one. Let me put it that way. I'm going to do something else. But so reaching this point of my career where I'm an executive chairman, um, and starting from, you read the book, so my grandmother, living with my grandmother when I was a little kid, and then
Which
spending
we have
summer.
to paint a picture of your grandmother for the listener because your grandmother was no ordinary grandmother.
No,
I mean, she's like a force. I picture this 4'10", 100-pound force of nature.
pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And she, she just led. She just, you know,
Yeah, leader
uh,
in the truest sense,
right. And that, but
making the mixed pickle, fixing mechanical things in the garden and in the
well,
farm and
she
just
it took care of the homestead, the 120 or so acres there, and she would save money and buy farmland that she rented out, from her manual labor. I mean, she did. I mean, not only did she run our homestead where, she was what we would call today, in all the TV shows, sustainable lifestyle, right?
yeah,
They made everything. And then she had this land business that over the years she built up, several hundred acres of rental farmland, that she rented out. And then my granddad was a small businessman too. So he cut trees and turned them into, smaller pieces of wood, in a sawmill. And so I realized much, I mean, fairly recently when I was writing the book that everything they had, they made
yeah,
everything. And, my granddad started out with mule teams, going in the woods and cutting trees and pulling out mule teams, with mule teams of the wood. And during the Depression, he would get this land for the taxes, or he would buy the timber off because people needed cash. And so they just kind of created this life out of what was around them. And, she was born around the turn of the century, and as he was. And, she used to tell me these stories that I later realized, about bears and wolves and, bandits, and they were probably true, in the 20s, and the teens in the 20s. And so I think, I clearly admired her, but she just did everything, and I didn't know anything else. That's what I learned was, if go do something
make
and
things
go
happen.
right and make things happen. And that was incredibly formative. My parents, on the other hand, wanted to get away from that life, and they took factory jobs, and they were union factory employees. My dad was United Auto Worker and my mom was United Steel Worker.
Mm,
They were union people through and through. The union took great care of them. Their companies, they didn't live long, but they had benefits, and we were very fortunate in that way that they had those jobs. But we didn't, it didn't translate into any kind of wealth or anything, but it was. But I couldn't even think about going down that path. It wasn't something, when it came time for me to go do something, um, it was different. I didn't want to go to work on the railroad, which was what out of my high school, my friends were like, boy, we get a job on the railroad, you can be there, you have a job for life, and it pays well, and I'm nothing against that, but I couldn't be that regimented.
yeah.
And it must have been this exposure to my grandmother and my grandfather of making something out of what was around them in a different way
And
that,
the entrepreneurial spirit. I mean, you
yeah,
were
yeah.
with her
And
every day,
yeah,
side by side with her, right?
right.
So tell us the gain, go through the acronym
So,
for us
so,
so
so
they
a
know
lot of
the
people say,
gain.
what have you done? How have you done what you've done? And so when I really I sat down and I went over everything, all the stuff we've been talking about over and over and over. I did this when, I did this when, I did that then I did this, and oh, I forgot this thing in the middle. And I came up with clearly kind of these, for me, and I think they're different for everybody. For me, 6 to 7 year cycles where I changed something, and I reached an inflection point, and then I looked at what I did, and so there was a go, right, where I said, okay, I'm going to go do that. Then there was, I get into it, and in some period of time, there would be an assessment where I'd start to assess, like, do I like this? Am I doing it? And then I would identify, then I would start to identify where my mind was going. And then there would be a next, which is a new go, kind of, right? But the next is planning and thinking
What's
about
out
it, and
there. Yeah.
yeah, well, before you actually do the go. Now, early on, these cycles are pretty close together. Like, you go into a job, you may decide a year, 6 months or a year in, it's not for you, and I had that. I had those little, like, mini gains, right, in there, and that's what I call it when I think about it, the formative years until I started building companies. Around 2000. I mean, I'm sorry, around 1980. I skipped a couple decades there, but around 1980. Is when I really started that made that mindset shift, right? And
Yeah.
I, I read some books, I learned things, I went back and got a master's degree, which was a little later after I had a company. And one day I said, I have like 300 employees and I don't have a degree, right? And that bothered me. And a friend of mine said, well, you could probably get in a master's program with everything, and I did. So I went to Northwestern, and um,
Oh, that's
I,
how you did it without the degree.
yeah, I had
I
to
was
take,
wondering how that worked, but it was because you had so much business experience that Northwestern was
well,
like,
I
come
had to
on over.
take these things called CLEP exams.
Okay.
And at the time, I was traveling like a madman, um, uh, building businesses and raising money. And
You studied
so
on
I
the
bought
plane
these
and stuff?
big, I had to take, I can't remember if it was 4 or 6 tests, right? And the study books are these big, thick books that it's just after, question after question of multiple choice, right? In English and math and different things. And there's some essay part of it, but I just took those tests until I could score 8 out of 10 pretty consistently while I was on
Hmm.
airplanes. I was carrying
Yeah.
these big books around. And then I walked into the testing place and I said, I'm signed up to take these club tests. And they're like, we've never had anybody take them all in one day. I said, well, I'm doing it.
Well,
right?
I just have to make it happen.
Right. And I
That's your
did it.
thing.
I took them all in one day, and I had to score 2550. I remember that. I scored a little bit better than that, maybe 2600, 2700.
Wow,
But then that was their criteria. They interviewed me. They said,
that was it.
Yeah, and I did that, and that so yeah,
Wait, can
that
I?
was
This is a random rabbit hole that I'm going to take you down. But
oh
in your
boy,
book, when you're talking about the assess phase,
yeah.
you said the best thing to do, or one of the most powerful tools in the assess phase is reading, not learning via audio or visual content. You're like reading words. And as a media guy, I was fascinated that you're like, here's a tip: don't use media, use reading words on a paper.
I read so fast that audiobooks slow me down.
Yeah,
And
interesting.
and that's why I don't have a tolerance for it. Now, I take in a ton of video and a ton of not as much audio, but I do listen to podcasts, right?
Yeah.
And but no, I think uh, that's interesting you had that takeaway because it's
It's
I
not too late to change your book, or
it
maybe it
is
is.
too late to change the book. Uh, but I would say that I'm just happen to be a reader first kind of
Yeah.
person. I love television. I love watching television. I love history. We went around the world a couple of years ago, and my mainly I did it because my wife had always said, "Yeah, I travel by the History Channel or Nat Geo. I get to see the world through Nat Geo." So um, we took an around the world trip, and is one of those Smithsonian things where you go with
Mhm.
like 48 couples go on a 757 and 11 stops, and we went around the world. And so that my when I started out, uh, I was working at Sinclair when I started planning that. And I thought, well, I can't take that much time off, so I want to look for the fastest way to go around the world.
Just gotta make it happen. Just gotta get around the
Right.
world.
And it was 3.5 weeks. So,
Wow, really?
yeah. And in all of my time, I'd never taken off a month. It was almost a month. I ended up on either side uh, because when we came back, we were really tired, and I didn't go to work for like 4 or 5 days. But um, the um, the point of that story, I think, was that you know you can find a way to do what you want to do. Of course, it helps that if you can pay for it, right? But
Yeah.
um, the shifting mindsets, the thinking about how to change your environment around you. So you ask about gain, right? And then uh, it really came from this deep analysis I did of everything I did over my career and spotting those cycles.
Yeah. So the cycle, just to break it down for, in a nutshell, the GAIN acronym is go, assess, identify, next.
Right.
And that is the 6 to 7 year cycle that
For me,
is
it was.
for you, right? I was interested that that was so long because I mean, I can relate to you as the go person. And for me, it feels like six to
Well,
seven years cycle time.
there can be cycles within, right?
Right.
So
And then these
what
leapfrog moments that
yeah,
you write
I was
about.
sort of I was subjective to how I said, okay, that's a real cycle, right?
Yeah.
Because you can have like little false starts and changes, and like the 10 years I spent at Comcorp, um, well, it wasn't quite 10 years, it was close. Cycles kind of they can overlap a little bit, right?
Hmm.
You can butt in things like the thing I put together with um, Sinclair with David Smith. I probably started working on in earnest around the mid 2000s, right? The idea. and I tested it in different ways while I was still CEO of this other company, and it didn't come about till 2013. So I was, doing a lot of work on it and thinking about what it would be, but I didn't know exactly how it would come to fruition. So at some point, I knew these cycles existed and they weren't just a stop start. They were like more a transition of how I was thinking, right? So I had to
Right.
decide, so you it might be easy to say cycles could easily be 3 years, right? You could
Yeah.
say, I'm going to go do this. You give it a year, you really start looking at it. You give it another year to try to make it work or make it fit your where your head is going, and then you think about it. But then maybe something happens in the same employer, you get promoted. So is that a new cycle?
Right.
Right.
Some
This,
cycles merge, right? You're doing something new at the same old place, and then you have a major pivot. But I think it's a helpful framework for people to understand where they are. I mean, I think about me and my career. I sold my business to Culture Partners 2.5 years
I
ago.
wondered about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a go, right? And
Yeah.
so now if I'm 2.5 years, I'm probably in assess right now, which
Yep.
feels about right of assessing
Yep.
how do I feel about this? What have the pros and cons been compared to what I thought they would be when I made the big bet, right? And then identifying, is there something else I want to do, either something else within Culture Partners or outside of Culture Partners? And what is the economy saying and the market saying and the world of work and all of that? I'm not at identify yet, but it feels like we're kind of moving into that direction to see what's
Mm-hmm.
next, also
Mm-hmm.
for the future of Culture
You
Partners.
got it. I mean,
Yeah,
the go, when you do the go, like you sold your company and you go into that, you're not looking at anything else. Your your commitment was, I've sold the company. You probably
go.
had an earnout. You probably had like some goals you had to meet,
Yeah.
right? And that is laser focus.
It's so motivating too, because I remember the
Oh, you're
metaphor
on
that I used to.
fire.
You're on fire. You're building the plane while flying it. And that's the time in your life where you're saying in the go phase, I'll sleep when I'm dead. Like we just have to go right now. There's
Yeah.
just that persistence and the relentlessness. That, I mean, I think we're the same. Our personalities are very similar, right? I think for some people, they don't have that. Like I have many friends who don't feel comfortable in that go phase necessarily. And you know, some of them are state workers and they love being a state worker. They love staying in the employee mindset. The moving to a business person mindset is of no interest of them whatsoever. And
I
that's
have thought of that exact thing so
really,
many times. Like, if I spoke to a college classroom, right, what would I say to them? One of the things I would say to them is, you could be a state worker or a city or county or um, a government employee, 30 years, you progress that out. You probably have a good retirement, right?
yeah,
And you
like your
can,
parents.
yeah, you can retire at 50 something or whatever, and or the business. Then I would start to, but I decided I need to work on that more because I felt like if I put that down on a chart, that it might be demotivating when I tell them, like, what do you want to do? Like, one of the things you can see I didn't get into, and I'm going to get into in future writings, is what are you trying to do income wise, right?
Yeah.
Where where do you want to oh, this is another story, but I can't start another story. But I once had a guy threaten to beat me up at my when he hired me at my interview. He had a little bit to drink and he kept saying, where do you want to land? And I said, well, I want to be president of the company, and he's hiring me to be CFO. And he's just got madder and madder. Where do you want to land? And he looked over at his partner and he said, this guy's so dumb. We ought to fire him right now. He doesn't know where. I'm asking him where does he want to land when I knock you out? Because he liked to
Oh,
drink and get into fights. And
that's amazing.
he
What a
he
job
was
interview.
he was really very incredibly instrumental in my formation. And despite his uh, sometimes uh, getting combative like that. He was an incredible person. He really
Mm,
made a difference to me. And he was the one who sort of asked me, "Do you have to tell everybody everything you know?" And
right.
he called me Mr. Steve, and that's another story. But um, the so the culmination of all of this is it started because telling the story started because people asked me like, "How did you do this?" Right? And then
Right.
I had to sit down and figure out because I had never asked myself, "How did I do it?" And then I started trying to put it into a form that would let people feel comfortable that they could do it. I'm not saying everybody can. If you tried to say, and you've threaded a couple of needles, right, in your career.
Yeah.
And so when you start, you don't want to say to nor do I want to say to people, you should think you could. I mean, I don't want to like impose a will on them. All I ever asked of my kids when they were growing up was whatever you do, just do it really to the best of your ability, right?
Yeah.
And what you pursue, try to do your best. I don't care if it's if honestly, let's say that you're a delivery man, a UPS delivery man, be the best one.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much the you know what I tried to instill in them. And then what I say to people, I don't want them to think like, oh, you need to think about how do I get to the 1%? How do I get to the 5%? How do I get to the 10%? I do think that if, sort of my next phase is I want to talk to people about what are your expectations of income and quality of life, and where do you need to get that, right?
Yeah.
Not saying,
Well, and there's a question that happens even before that, right? Because sometimes I wonder, maybe I'm just, now that I'm a mother and I'm in my 40s and everything's different, sometimes I wonder, like, could I have been way happier if I had lived a much simpler, lower income, less strenuous life? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not saying the answer is yes, but the question is something I never considered before now, right?
yes. So I don't know when I started to think about it uh, as like, I always just thought I'll make the money, right? Required, whatever. I didn't really think about it in terms of a number or a thing. And sometimes when I look back, it scares the daylights out of me because it's like one different move could have been like really differentiating. I didn't realize how close I came. And as I talk to people today who kind of missed their opportunity, or they're stuck in middle management, or they feel like they should be able to go up, but they don't feel like they can. Um, one thing as tell them is, look, it's almost never too late. Like I did this last thing when I was 65. I did the next one before that when I was 58.
Yeah.
I'm talking to a lot of guys in their 50s, and they're like, "Oh, my career is stuck. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything." And I tell them, "Don't think that way. You got a lot of runway left, you know."
Yeah.
But yes, do you have to thread a needle right now? Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
I mean, because it ticks away before you know it. And so, there's a couple of distinct cycles, 58 to 65, 65 to now, where they happen to be actual gains. They actually happen to be gain cycles, right?
Yeah.
They so we can see one is 7 and one is going on 5,
Right.
and so there you go.
So I want to go just acknowledge your sons. I watched a peach cake video this morning. You write about your
Oh,
sons in the book. You two sons that have passed away.
that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Peach cake in particular. Um, Stefan was, a pure artistic person
Creative.
and creative and did a lot. And, he was born with this heart condition and multiple surgeries, and he never held back.
Mm,
He never let it hold him back, and he never held back. And he created, and he was talented, and I think but for COVID he might still be with us. He got COVID and his system, there was no way as
yeah.
delicate as he got over COVID, but I think later it triggered something.
Mm,
And he had been on tour, and he had this really bizarre illness before anybody knew what it was, and he was really sick, and it wasn't strep, and it wasn't flu, and it wasn't anything, and then it was respiratory, but he eventually got over it. But then later that year he passed away from some kind of heart event, and in the height of COVID. So, and Alex was somewhat artistic, but really mechanical and like work with his hands um, more. He was a race car driver, but uh, he could weld, he could build, he could make things, which were two sides that I really encourage both of them. Like I would say to somebody that they both were down a path I think they were going to love, right? And um, we talk about this. We were just talking about it. Like, how do you tell somebody I was counseling a friend who has really tough medical diagnosis with his wife, and it's not good, and it's like for certain terminal
mm,
and soon. And it's like, I said, look, I can't relate because mine was just over when it was over. It was over.
right.
Yours is going to be over. And I said, the only thing that we could really do is say, well, after Alex passed, we said he would not approve of us just giving up. And there's still Stefan.
Yeah.
When Stefan passed, it was then how would there's us, right, to go on for, but neither one of them would say you should give up, right? You should just
Mm,
sit around and mourn. That's not what they would have wanted. So when people ask me, like, how do you then find purpose? I find it in them.
yeah.
And denial.
And denial.
I just didn't, I
And
just
just
act
making it happen to avoid feeling my feelings.
right. I just really believe they're alive. I just
Yeah.
can't contact them, right?
Yeah.
And that they're off doing something, right? That's how I have to think about it. And, that is, uh, there's a lot of learning there. Um, Probably my greatest fear, and it's very difficult, but I do talk about it. I like to talk about it, but it's incredibly difficult um, for me to actually touch it. And there are still things I can't do. I can't go to races where we went. I'm a sim racer. My hobby is sim racing, which
Mm,
is some people would say gaming. It's not video gaming. For those of us who are sim racers, it's it's racing in a simulator, right? But even racetracks where he raced, I've just started to like in the kind of car he raced. I this year I was able to go race at Kokomo, Indiana, where see there it is, and that thing is the thing that is really difficult, right? It's so there's ones for Stefan too. Um, but you just don't. You still have to kind of go. I mean, it's just not. It's not in a person. I mean, you can take some time. You can process it. I didn't. I plunged right. Surprise. Plunged right back in,
Mm-hmm.
and after Alex died, and then just kept going, right? And that's the denial part, right? You just like, but having said that, you find ways to process it, little tiny bits. Little, at least that's what I did. I always tell people, look at your own journey.
Yeah.
It's yours, nobody else's. You do what you have to do. You will find the way to do it and the reason to do it. But I can't tell you what that is.
Mm.
And so that's, I appreciate you bringing that up, and I probably would have brought it up, but I mean, there's a lot, and I think that's some of what drives me to do this thing where I give back to people um, the benefit of what I've been able to see, do, experience, um, share with them insights, because I've been given so many. Not all of them great, right?
Yeah.
But that is how, if I have to look back now and say, what did I get? Well, I got a lot of stuff that some was great, some wasn't so great, some was really tragic and traumatic and challenging and difficult. But how do I build something out of that, right?
Yeah.
So,
And give back
right,
through
and
it,
get back. Yeah.
which
So,
you have. I mean, for when does your book come out? I want people to get it because
January.
January, I was inspired by it. It
Wow.
wow, you think
Yeah.
it's wow? I mean, that's very humble of you.
I,
I I like that you're surprised that I was inspired by your book. I mean, it was actually my favorite. I knew I was liking the book the whole time from the very beginning to the end, but I want to read the acknowledgments at the end because that's when I was like, okay, I am Steve's biggest fan. The acknowledgments. Can I read this?
yeah,
You're
go
thanking
ahead.
all the people,
But
and
I
then you
do
go,
probably have
also,
to go. But I mean, I want to
no,
hear
this
this.
is, we're going to keep going. It says, also, I want to thank all the people who resisted or opposed my ideas, the ones who undermined my plans overtly and subvertly, those who stabbed me in the back and in the face, and those who competed with me or just plain didn't like me. Because without you, I never would have gained the survival tools or mentality to succeed in business at the highest levels. That's such a mic drop. Just brilliant, you know? What a
Well,
great way to end the book.
yeah, it came about in a funny way, um, and that I was trying to write these acknowledgments, and I'm going to leave people out. I'm going to forget people. I can't possibly do it. And I um, said, well, nobody reads acknowledgments anyway. So what if I did this? And the guy that was the final like process
Editor,
editor,
yeah.
yeah, he liked it, and he said that's perfectly acceptable. And and so it turns out, see, you read it and it meant
I
something.
thought it was the highlight of the book. People do read the acknowledgments. I read the acknowledgments.
Yeah. Well, you're an author, and I am so impressed by your comprehension of everything, and you do this, so easily. I mean, it looks so naturally that you take this in. You just, I'm really impressed.
Well,
Um,
thank you. I like to learn. I like to read, and I liked
that's
your
pretty
book.
clear.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, we should listen. I do have to go because I told somebody I'd meet them at 3:30 across the
Okay,
street.
sorry, I'm keeping you from. I'm like, just let the interview go. I'm learning so much. Meanwhile, you're
Yeah,
like, dude, I have to wrap.
but I
Okay,
would
let me
be
wrap up the
okay.
podcast. Thank you, Steve, for coming on this podcast. There is one last question, but I'm going to let you opt out of it since I've kept you so late. And I'm just so grateful that you took the time. I'm grateful of your
Well, I
contribution to
think
the
you've
game
already
principle.
answered that last question.
Yeah, we probably have answered the last question.
Yeah,
It's about your
which
son.
was, what don't people ask me, right? It's about my
Yeah, what
boys.
don't people ask you that you wish they would ask you about more often?
People don't ask about the boys, and I understand why, right?
Yeah, right.
And so I didn't even know by the way, until you asked me, I didn't know the answer to this
Yeah.
question.
Well,
But
and there it is.
see, it really was the last question. That is the thing. People won't ask you because they think it's intruding. And look, it could be with some people, but there's nothing I would rather talk about than them.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's so sweet. Well, thank you, Steve. It was such a
thank you.
pleasure.